In the early years of the internet, it was a new frontier in technology, communication, and entrepreneurship. From small seeds grew big tech, creating the landscape of the internet as we know it today.
Tonight, the information superhighway and one of its main thoroughfares, an online network called Internet.
The internet changed everything. It was an analog world, and now it's a virtual world, a digital world. It changed how we relate to each other, how we speak, how we connect, how we shop, how we consume the news.
You can now glimpse the future with nothing more than a modem, a phone line, and a few dollars a month.
Before the internet as we know it today, communications and media were very much a one-way avenue.
It made the world a very flat world when it came to news, as opposed to the sort of hierarchical situation we had before.
No longer were people bound by the gatekeepers of old media. Now anyone could post a comment, share a video, or, more importantly, break a story.
Because of that, we hear way more diverse voices. We have way more opportunities to communicate, even if we're not in the major cities or not connected to the major media companies.
But with that arose new questions about who's responsible for what gets created and posted online. Enter Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act.
This law is truly revolutionary legislation that will bring the future to our doorstep.
It is a tiny law that's had a huge impact on the internet as we know it. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle want to change the way the law works, affecting how content is moderated online.
Section 230 is the most important law protecting internet speech. And removing Section 230 will remove speech from the internet.
When we wrote Section 230, my chief co-sponsor, Ron Wyden, he and I, from different political perspectives, agreed that the government should stay out of this business of regulating speech on the internet because only bad things could come from this.
But since those early days, some people think Section 230 is allowing big tech to avoid responsibility, especially for harmful content posted on their websites, and for how they moderate it.
I would attribute the fact that tech companies, or let's say social media platforms, have been moderating more to just the sheer reality that our public discourse and our political discourse has been more online than ever. Because of that, obviously, there are more problems that have been created that have pressured the tech industry to moderate more.
Facebook has come under fire recently for its role in last year's election.
You must do better to protect the American people.
Exactly what's behind Facebook and Google's recent crackdown on fake news sites.
Facebook has taken action against what it calls harmful misinformation from President Trump on the coronavirus.
We are not going to go away, gentlemen.
I think the biggest threat to free speech in America and the biggest threat to democracy in our elections is big tech censorship.
This is part of a long-term movement for them to be held more responsible for what shows up on their site.
3 executives really facing questions about how they moderate content on their platforms.
Facebook promises to flag or in some cases remove misinformation about voting related to the coronavirus.
Now, the FCC is looking to take action to reform Section 230 of the Communications Decency
Section
Act.
230, that has really been the focus of many lawmakers.
My executive order calls for new regulations under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act.
Section 230 should be revoked immediately.
Whose fault is it? How did all this happen? Is there a way to fix fake news, censorship, and trolls? Or will the solution to these problems end up destroying the internet as we know it?
Anything that one can conceive of is now at our fingertips, and this is surely not the way the world looked in the 1990s.
If the internet then was the Wild West, you know, a lot of these companies were sort of the early settlers, right? They were going out and seeing what could get done, what would get them killed, what would get them sick. They were figuring it all out, and they were building cities and towns.
The internet before Section 230 very much was the Wild West because there was a distinction between distributors and publishers, and there was very much a disincentive to moderate.
Section 230 is a pretty simple law. It says that we're going to punish the guilty and protect the innocent. when individual content creators on the internet upload to a website, the question in law arises, who's responsible for what they just said?
It basically says two things. It says, one, the platforms will not be treated as speakers or publishers held liable for third-party content, user-generated content. And then the second part says, that they can moderate without the fear of lawsuit. It immunizes them.
Because it is not reasonable to expect a website to read everything that users post on that site, we will hold them responsible only when they actually participate in the creation of the content. And that's how Section 230, in a nutshell, allocates responsibility.
Section 230 was looking to reduce the Wild West atmosphere by saying you can do moderation and you're not going to face more liability.
If you look at when Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act was adopted, it was a very different time. It was the dawn of the internet. It was the dawn of all of these tech companies.
The current internet that we know today, the websites, the platforms, could not exist in their current format if we hadn't had Section 230.
Now that this frontier has become an established place for billions of people visiting every day, is it time to rein in some of those less desirable parts of the internet?
There are a lot of things that social media has brought the world. It kept it more connected, for example, during the pandemic.
It allows people who otherwise would have no voice at all to be able to communicate their thoughts and to have an impact. It also allows bad actors to amplify their voices, to spread disinformation, to harass people, to spread lies about individuals that ruin their lives.
Anytime you blow up the gatekeepers, right, you allow sort of the viral mobs to decide what's important, and that isn't always right. And as a society, you decide, right, that is not something that we want to see online. We don't want this to flourish online. So that gets into the content moderation and the appropriateness of that. But I think the flip side of that question is are we still in a gatekeeperless world? I don't know that we are.
Facebook banning several high-profile extremist figures.
Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg recently explained why censorship isn't really bad. In fact, it saves lives.
Twitter has banned the president indefinitely. That's going to put pressure on Facebook to ban the president indefinitely as well.
And other social media platforms targeting their bias against President Trump and conservatives online.
From the dawn of time, there have been biased journalists. That's nothing new. That's from the very first journalists who carved words into a stone tablet. There were biased journalists. What's different is the unrivaled, the massive power big tech has. There's never been any journalistic outlet with the kind of monopoly power that big tech has.
Moderation at scale is close to impossible. Imagine Twitter having to approve, a human having to approve every single tweet that all of us want to put out every day. That scale is impossible. Obviously, if we make platforms liable for what others say on those platforms, they're going to over-moderate.
I would be shocked at this scale if there was ever a day where there wasn't a controversial moderation decision.
Of course they can moderate content however they want, but Section 230 makes it very permissive for them to do so, because they simply can. There's no consequence.
Some think big tech's moderation has gone too far. And now it's time to tell them to either play nice or lose their liability protection under Section 230.
Who in their right mind would want all political discourse in America governed by a handful of Silicon Valley billionaires with unfettered power to silence anyone? That's what we have right now, and I think it threatens our elections, it threatens democracy, it threatens free speech in a way we've never seen before in our nation's history.
I think the big social media companies now do act as gatekeepers. The more they editorialize, the more they moderate when you get into political viewpoints and science, as we're seeing with COVID-19. All of that is a function of a gatekeeper. And so that's really what the question is about, is can we preserve that free and open internet with the current platforms that we have now?
Big tech is no longer providing neutral public fora. The giant tech companies, Google, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, they use their monopoly power to silence and censor speech. They've given up on any pretense of being neutral. And in my view, if they're not going to be neutral, if they're going to be partisan, if they're going to engage in censorship, there's no way on earth they should have a special immunity from liability given by Congress that nobody else gets.
They ought to embrace the same First Amendment values that everybody else embraces. And so no discrimination on the basis of your political views. If they want to discriminate, they shouldn't get the special deals from government.
If they're going to maintain this market presence, and it's an untouchable one, I think it's realistic to ask, should the government subsidize it? And two, should we demand more of an open and honest accounting for how they moderate content, and if they should be more fair about it?
For years, I've asked them in writing, I've asked them in hearings, simple questions like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google. How many posts from Republican candidates for office have you blocked, have you shadow banned, or have you throttled, restricted the people who've seen it? There is a number. It is a concrete, exact number. It's an integer. And they know what it is, but nobody else does. So they refuse to answer that question. All of the big tech companies say, we ain't going to tell you. That unchecked power is dangerous, and right now Section 230 is part of how Congress continues to protect these monopolies that are abusing their power and that are trying to silence you.
As good as Section 230 has been for the internet, the insidious part of it is that there's no accountability. They can look the other way legally when bullying, harassment, all kinds of things happen on their sites because they're not liable for it. And so they can look the other way, and they frequently do. So no, I don't think that they are taking enough responsibility, and I think that's what a lot of proponents of Section 230 reform, that's the point that they make. They want more accountability from these platforms.
Amazon Web Services warned them that they were seeing violent content on there, that Parler didn't have a good enough plan to moderate that content. So now Amazon Web Services has cut off Parler as well. That means Parler doesn't really have anywhere to go, at least for the next few days.
The question of what to do about big tech censorship is a difficult question. I will readily concede as a policy matter, that is not easy to solve. Nobody in their right mind wants to see a federal government speech police.
Some of these smaller platforms in particular need that liability protection to grow. That was the original intent of the law, right? Was to sort of give this protection to small companies so they could be successful.
But it's no longer the case that tech companies are these tiny little startups, that it's no longer the case that they're a couple of kids starting something in their college dorm room and trying to see if it can last. So it then becomes a thorny problem. All right, how do you solve this blatant censorship and bias coming from Silicon Valley? The first, which we're talking about right now, is repealing or modifying Section 230, is eliminating the special immunity from liability that big tech gets that was based on the belief that they would be neutral public fora. They've abandoned that promise. They've decided they're not neutral, they're partisan. They will silence your views if they disagree with them.
But what if changing this fundamental underpinning of the internet does more than just encourage free speech and stop the spread of fake news? What if it breaks the internet, like an ox cart fording a floodplain?
In the 21st century, when virtually every business has both an online and an offline presence, that business simultaneously benefits from the protections of Section 230 when it is eligible for them, and is made liable for the postings of users when the website itself is a participant, even if just in part, in the creation or development of that content. And that law applies equally to everyone as well, without which the internet really could not function, or at least it could not function as a friendly place for individual people to post content that they have created.
The reason another nation with more people, including more computer users like China or India, that had a functioning interactive network before us, like say France, have failed to dominate the net is our foundation of internet laws that kept lawyers and politicians and tax collectors from hobbling innovation and hobbling growth.
Any tech company, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, whoever that is, are a private company, and I don't have a right to be on the platform, and I don't have a right to say everything I want to say on that platform. So it is up to them to decide what they do, and it's up to me as a consumer and each and every one of us to decide if we want to be on these platforms.
There are really two ways to come at this problem of censorship and bias and so on. One way is to have a government mandate about what websites have to say. Lots of bad things happen when we place the government in charge, when we make this all the subject of lawsuits and we inflict on websites responsibility for not what they did, but what others did.
An example of this and an analogy that I would want to use is what happened when the Fairness Doctrine was passed and what happened to broadcasters. Fairness Doctrine was a policy that demanded that broadcasters air both sides of a political opinion. What it led to was over-censorship by the broadcasters themselves. They would only let very moderate, in-the-middle opinions air. And that policy was vetoed later by President Reagan. And we hopefully don't see that happen to the internet, because if I was Twitter and I was held liable for everything people say on Twitter, all I would allow is probably photos of dogs and cats.
The alternative is to say that if you don't like the editorial outlook of a particular website, hopefully you can find another website. Hopefully there will be many such websites. In fact, at this very moment in the United States, any internet user has access to 200 million websites. There is an enormous amount of variety and choice. Now, it is true that today we have some kings of the hill in social media and in search, but if one goes back only a few years, you'll see that the kings of the hill were different companies.
So when we first had MySpace and AOL, Yahoo, all the tech companies in the early 2000s, there were a lot of critics who said they're monopolists and they're never going to go away, that they're too big to fail. And then what did we see? We saw different disruptors come into the market.
There's a cover of one of the business magazines, I think Forbes or Fortune, from the mid-2000s. It's a big picture of the people who founded MySpace, and the headline is something along the lines of, will anyone be able to stop MySpace? And the answer ends up being yes, of course. There are legitimate concerns about competition in social media, absolutely. Whether Section 230 is the answer for it is a tougher question.
Amending Section 230 in a way that's not careful can just lead to rerouting the whole innovation sector and the way companies develop in the future.
So it's worth imagining what the world would look like without 230.
We could go back to more of a one-way communication street where, platforms just say, without Section 230, we just don't want to take the risk of allowing people to post whatever they want. So we're just going to narrow the avenues, if not eliminate them altogether.
When SESTA/FOSTA passed in 2018, the reasoning and the energy behind that bill was to protect victims of sex trafficking.
The dark side of the internet here is that groups like Backpage.com are selling women and children online. We've introduced very targeted, specific legislation to take away the immunity for entities that facilitate sex trafficking.
No one who criticized that bill was against that goal, but what we warned about has happened. There are a lot of parts of websites, including Craigslist, that have fully shut down.
I think the world will live without the Craigslist personal section, but I think it's more of a lesson for future changes to Section 230, in that a lot of platforms will say, we just can't take the risk because the platforms are businesses and they're going to make these risk-based decisions. And I think that was really a wake-up call and saying, okay, well, Section 230 does make a difference to a lot of the business models of these platforms.
It is sometimes said that Section 230 requires viewpoint neutrality. I can assure you, as the author of the law, that was never the intent, nor could it be under any reasonable circumstances, nor does the statute say anything of the kind if one just takes the time to read it. And if you think about it for a moment, it's pretty clear why this must be so. How could the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee even have a website if it were required that there be viewpoint neutrality and they couldn't favor the political opinion that they were set up to advance?
This is all to say that different proposals that exist to amend Section 230 never take into consideration all the negative, unintended consequences that would be created. And it is, in my personal opinion, it's just a tool to go after tech companies that have angered a certain group of people.
There's a duel raging over this tech frontier, and everybody's on the front porch watching. By dusk, only one will be left standing.
I want to live in a world with tech. I think tech has done amazing things, transformational things for society. But I want to live in a world where these companies feel accountable, and I want them to be more transparent. They don't feel accountable to their user base because they are untouchable and unthreatened by any market forces, and they don't feel accountable to the government.
It was a move by Facebook yesterday to ban President Trump's account, quote, indefinitely.
The more disturbing story today, I think, is that Apple is saying to Parler, which is an alternative to Twitter, we're going to kick you off unless you do what we want in terms of censoring conservatives. Now, that is really frightening.
If Twitter and Facebook can, in a second, just silence the president, cut him off from his followers, is that simply too much power? Is the problem not just the president himself, but the power of the platforms as well?
I think there should be a strong incentive in federal law for the big tech companies to go back to being neutral public forum. They know how to do it. They were that for years. Because if they silence anyone who disagrees with the left-wing orthodoxy, we'll only hear one view. It would be like being trapped in a CNN newsroom all day long. That's the world of big tech, but it's even worse because it's 3 or 4 billionaires in Silicon Valley deciding what you get to hear, what you get to say, what you get to know. That is an incredible danger to our Constitution, to our Bill of Rights, and to our democracy.
I think that we want to maintain the free and open discussion that we have on the internet, and we want to allow as many voices to be heard as possible, but we also at the same time want to make sure that people are safe. And I feel like one of the really big benefits of this current debate is that we're really starting to have that discussion about what are society's expectations for what the internet will look like.
What we want to make sure of is that we preserve a healthy competitive environment, that we have in particular low barriers to entry, which Section 230 is very relevant to because the legal certainty that it provides for even the smallest website means that investors can put their money behind such a venture without risk of having it all destroyed in a flood of litigation. But competition and choice for internet consumers was what we had in mind when we wrote Section 230 in the first place, and it's more important now than ever.
We have to believe in future and be the friends of future and not the enemies of it. We can't regulate or stop harm, some hypothetical harm, from happening. What we can do is punish any company or any individual who creates real harm and go after them. At the same time, by having a more hands-off approach, we're going to continue to let the community and the society innovate and take us to the next horizon of a future that we don't even know how it would look, but it's going to be better and more connected, and we're going to create even better community online.
The debate over free speech, regulation, and innovation continues. But the big question to ask yourself is, are there still more frontiers to explore?
Elizabeth Warren tweeted out, she said, well, this shows why big tech has too much power. And I did something I've very rarely done. I retweeted Elizabeth Warren.
I think about the signing ceremony at which Section 230 became law. It took place in the Library of Congress. Bill Clinton was president. Al Gore, the inventor of the internet, was vice president.
And I have no desire to be a part of the internet because I feel like I'm so inundated with information all the time that I don't want more.